Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Josh Freeman about improving production practices for industrial hemp. Industrial hemp has only recently been reintroduced into American production systems. Therefore, there's still a lot to learn about how to best produce this versatile crop. This episode, Josh discusses his work testing current growing practices to see where improvements can be made. Don't forget to listen to the end of the show for our student spotlight. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsors, starting with Gasman Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers and ruminant emissions. Visit www.gasmet.com, that's Gasmet spelled Gasmet, or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. Our second sponsor is Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Josh Freeman with us. Josh received his bachelor's degree in entomology from Clemson University before going to the University of Florida, where he earned his PhD in horticultural sciences. He served on the faculty at Virginia Tech as an assistant professor and the state vegetable specialist for 6 years, and then moved to University of Florida, where he served as associate professor and extension specialist at the North Florida Research and Education Center. He recently moved to private industry, where he is a corporate agronomist for Trieste Ag Group, providing technical support and working in the area of market development. Hi, Josh. How are you doing today?
So far, so good.
Wonderful. We are so happy to have you on the show. So today we are talking about improving hemp growing practices for our farmers. So before we get started, I just wanted to kind of have like the hemp conversation, as we are a US-based podcast. So can you kind of give us an overview of hemp in the US, kind of what's like the current legal situation for growing, researching, and maybe some background on hemp and its various uses and how it's grown and harvested for these purposes?
Sure. So that's a bit to unpack. So as most listeners in the U.S. will know, that there has been a prohibition on the production of cannabis in the U.S. for 60 years, 70 years. And starting with the 2014 Farm Bill, the federal government allowed states to implement their own pilot programs. That's what they call the pilot programs. And every state had the option to format the pilot programs differently. And some formatted the program so that states could do research on it. Their land grant institutions could do research on it. Some formatted their pilot programs where farmers could actually start growing industrial hemp. And just to take a step back, industrial hemp is cannabis. It could be one of 2 or 3 different cannabis species. Most commonly, it's cannabis sativa. And so cannabis sativa, the difference between marijuana and industrial hemp, at least in the U.S., is defined by its THC content. So THC is the cannabinoid, the class of metabolites in cannabis. That particular metabolite, THC, is the one that's associated with the hallucination, euphoric effect. So to be defined as industrial hemp, it's got to have a THC content of less than 0.3%. So anything above 0.3% would be marijuana. Anything less than 0.3 would be classified as industrial hemp. So this creates a little bit of a problem. So a plant could technically be industrial hemp one week, and THC could increase, and then the following week it could be marijuana. So, but that's really what defines industrial hemp. And so industrial hemp has been used by civilizations all over the globe for a multitude of uses. Primarily, at least in its early uses, was for its fiber content. Industrial hemp is known for its exceptional fiber characteristics, and so that's one of its major uses. And so you'll see that in industrial hemp, there's really two very different production systems that could be used for industrial hemp. Whether it's used for, we'll often refer to it as grain and fiber types, and so there's usually very different varieties that are used for grain and fiber. Grain, I mean, you can most people across the U.S. could go to any retail store and find hemp grain. So it's used a high protein grain source, or the fiber could be used for clothing, any other manufacturing processes. And so the other side of the hemp production system, or other major system, would be where it's being used to extract essential oils. So these would, the most commonly used ones would be the terpenes and cannabinoids. And so there's a bunch of different cannabinoids. The primary cannabinoids in industrial hemp would be CBD, CBG, and THC. And so CBD was initially of its greatest interest. So that started in 14, where states were allowed to set these pilot programs up. The 2018 Farm Bill broadly legalized production of industrial hemp, really anywhere in the U.S. And so that's kind of how we came into the pilot program at University of Florida, was to do research to establish agronomic practices for industrial hemp. And specifically our research site in North Florida, we were tasked with looking at the essential oil types, so the ones that were going to be produced for the cannabinoids.
Okay, that is a super helpful overview. I have a couple follow-up questions. So when you see like hemp lotions and like shampoos, like where is that just oils and things that they're extracting? Like where does that factor in?
Yeah, I mean, it probably has one of the essential oils from hemp, or the terpenes from hemp. So if anyone's ever smelled cannabis, I mean, that's what you're smelling, is the terpenes and the volatiles. So I mean, it could be any number of things that are being extracted from hemp. I mean, the seed can actually be crushed, and so that's where I think that's another very critical point to make early in this podcast, is that hemp oil can come from two different things. It can come from crushing the seed, like we would do commonly with oil seeds in the U.S., whether it's soybean or canola, whatever it is. So you could get oil, you could extract oil from that. But the essential oils that we were focusing on actually come from the flowers. So primarily from the female flowers of cannabis plants. So you could get, I mean, it's tough to say when you get something that's got hemp products in it, who knows where it's coming from.
Sure.
I think it's just hopefully defined on the product.
Sure. Okay. And then, so for the fiber use, is that primarily coming from like the stalks and stems? Is it a leaf thing? I mean, how do we go from a plant to like a rope or a shirt in that sense?
Sure. Yeah, that's going to primarily come from the main stalk. And so that's it. So if you went and saw a field of fiber hemp, it would look very similar to, say, a small grain like wheat or oats in its the way it's planted. So the plant populations are very, very high. The rows are spaced narrow, because all you really want is the central stalk. So the leaves, those aren't really of any value from a fiber production standpoint. So that's really what you want. You want a lot of plants per acre with a very tall main stalk. And so fiber hemp, we'd want it to be 8-10 feet tall, 600,000 to 800,000 plants per acre, mechanical harvest. So that's where that side of the hemp production system is kind of very different from the essential oil types.
Okay. That is very helpful for just laying out how this all works together. So you were working on some ways to improve production for hemp, and you had two different hypotheses, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about maybe how these different kinds of plants are grown in this. But what were the two experiments you were trying to lay out here?
Sure. The core was to look at two of the major kind of underlying agronomic practices that we want to define in any new production system. And though hemp production is not new per se to the U.S., it's been a long time, and the use for cannabinoids is very new to us. So our goal was to define an appropriate plant population. How many plants per acre do we need to use to maximize the yield? And another practice common in cannabis is what's referred to as pinching. Usually pinching is the most common term, and that's so the very apical meristem, top of the apical meristem of the plant is removed, and the thought process is that it will cause increased lateral branching. So you remove that apical dominance that we see in most plants that have a kind of a let's just call it a Christmas tree shape. So you would ideally take the top out of it, and then that causes the side branches to grow more. So you don't have what we refer to as more of a cactus shape. I mean, if you're used to seeing saguaro cactus, that where these side branches kind of grow more than the top. So that's what the hypothesis was. If we remove the top, then we'd have increased size on our lateral branches and potentially more yield. So that's what we're trying to do, figure out how many plants per acre we needed to maximize yield, and if this practice of pinching actually improved yield.
Okay. So then how did you go about testing these hypotheses?
We did field experiments in North Florida, just outside of Tallahassee is where our research facility was located. So listeners may be familiar with what they may have seen, some hemp that's produced now. And so the problem with kind of looking in retrospect is when hemp was first legalized in or even pilot program states in, say, 2016, 17, 18, the value of hemp extract was one number, and that number now is significantly less. And so in hindsight, these production systems seem very expensive compared to what the value of hemp is now. But so we, at the time, production of hemp for essential oils and our research was conducted using a system we call plasticulture. So if listeners are familiar with vegetable production, where they use raised rows that are covered with plastic film, that's what we use, because there's limited weed control options for industrial hemp. So it was field experiments conducted in the summer, outdoors on raised beds covered with plastic, and so that's how we conducted our experiments.
Why are there so few weed control options for hemp as opposed to other plants?
It's for herbicides to be able to be used, they have to be registered, and that's not an easy process. I mean, there has to be tolerances. There has to be a registrant, so a manufacturer who wants to have a given herbicide or fungicide or whatever labeled in a crop, so that they have to be tested. This package has to be presented to the EPA. The EPA has to approve it, and then it's registered and labeled in given crops and given states. So currently, I think there are, even back as far as 15, 16, there was skepticism on part of registrants about the stability and the longevity of this industry. So there's just been skepticism because it's a very expensive process for a registrant, whether it's any ag chemical manufacturer to get a registration. So that's why there's very few labeled products.
So they have to like test it for that specific crop. It's not like they're just like, oh, it's good against this weed. It's like it has to be good against this weed, for example, without killing your intended crop or whatever else.
Exactly. Yeah, so you have to demonstrate efficacy. You have to demonstrate safety on a given crop. And there has to be residue analysis, right? So we're, and it's the ability to do that in fiber crops, stuff that we don't consume. It tends to be a little easier. But, for the essential oil side of industrial hemp, we're consuming these things. So I think that's where the potential slow ups in registration come.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. And then final question before I move on to the results, hopefully, maybe we'll see, is how are you mentioned you are using the flowers for the oils. So how are those harvested? Are you just, is that by hand? Is there special machinery that you're using? I'm curious how all of like the pinching is done, how the harvesting is done, particularly with the plasticulture and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's another major difference now when we look on this research or that kind of fledgling industry in hindsight is the amount of manual labor that was invested in these crops, because at the time the economics could support it. There was hand harvest of the flowers. So typically what was done, if you would have gone to an industrial hemp farm in 2019 or so, whole plants would have been harvested. They may have even been hung to dry, like some listeners may be familiar with tobacco production. So they were dried in forced air to bring the moisture content down, and then the flowers were stripped either with some mechanical means or by hand off of the main stem, because the stems didn't really have any value. So the flowers were removed by hand. Pinching was done by hand. And so you can imagine with all of this manual labor, it really, really escalated the cost of hemp production. So it was produced, and a lot of the production methods and the practices were essentially adopted from medical marijuana production. And so obviously the economics of medical marijuana are very different than the economics of industrial hemp. And so I think the value of the crop, that's why people are looking or trying to mechanize, whether it's for grain and fiber or for the cannabinoids. Mechanization is a necessity based on the current economic models of those crops.
Sure. Okay, I lied. One more question. So you mentioned, if they hang things and then you said the stems aren't really valuable, is it just like there's no fiber value at all for stems if they're grown for the oils? Is it just that it doesn't produce a good product, or is it just the way that it's harvested either makes that not feasible at that point, or is too much of a hassle to make it economically viable? Why is it not sometimes just both harvested?
Yeah, that's really what it is from let's say a fiber standpoint, you've probably got a minimum of 500,000 plants per acre. And from the cannabinoid standpoint, you may have 4,000 plants per acre. And they look very different. A large plant that's grown for essential oils might be 6 or 8 feet tall. It may have a stem at its base that would have a diameter of 4 inches. And so they don't really look, other than the leaves, they don't look very, very similar. And so, there's not enough mass to make it worthwhile to use use the stems for fiber in a cannabinoid production system. Now there is some, at least initially, there was some effort to to try to harvest the apical flowers off of grain and fiber types. You can find pictures of these kind of dual use combines on the internet. And so I think there's probably more potential to take some of the flowers off of grain and fiber types for at least fiber types. Grain types, that they have to be dried down before they're combined. They'd be combined with a combine that would be typically used for any other small grain. But for fiber types, you could potentially harvest it and still take some of the floral material from the apex of the plant and extract that. So it's probably easier to take a fiber type and get some essential oils out of it than it is to take an essential oil type and get use it for fiber.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Josh's paper, How Do Pinching and Plant Density Affect Industrial Hemp Produced for Cannabinoids in Open Field Conditions, published in Agronomy Journal, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Meter Group and Gasman Technologies. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. For Gasman Technologies, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for field work weighing 20.7 pounds. The GT5000 Terra is splash-proof IP54 rated with an internal pump and battery and instantaneous readings of up to 50 gases at sub-ppm concentrations. Check out the quick setup guide and learn more about Gasman Technologies at www.gasman.com and the links in the show notes. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I also had no idea they were so huge, so I'm learning a lot today. But that was actually my last question before moving on to the results. So what did you find?
Yeah, so the other thing that we allude to a bit in the paper is that hemp is a day length sensitive crop. So people are probably familiar with soybeans that are day length sensitive. And so if you take the wrong group soybean, planted at the wrong latitude, then it's either going to be super tall and never flower, or very short and have 6 to 8 pods on it. So hemp is the same way. So you have most hemp that we have tested is probably around 13 to 14 hours of critical day length. And so anything less than that, hemp is going to flower. Anything more than that, it'll stay in a vegetative state. And so what we found, we always try to use kind of a mid-season planting date. And what we found is that so we went around to producers in the Southeast to just look at what their current practices were. And based on our results, we found out that their plant populations, let's just use the plant population data, the plant populations they were commonly using were way too low. They were typically in the range of, say, 1,500 plants per acre, give or take. And our data showed that was really, really too low, probably half as much as it needed to be. But the caveat or the asterisk to put on that is it really all depends on planting date. So the earlier in the season, this is the one factor that we didn't investigate just because it was really too burdensome to do. If a grower planted at the very, very beginning of their planting window, so in North Florida, South Georgia, that would be sometime in May. So, middle of May, we get above that critical day length, that 14-hour day length. So if you were to plant at the beginning of May, you could really use a lower plant population because those plants are going to grow vegetatively until August when they flower, versus if you plant it in July, you would only have 2 to 3, 4 weeks before where they grew vegetatively before they flowered. So it's a bit of a sliding scale, but we found for those middle season planting dates that the common knowledge on plant population was too low. And so we found that we could significantly increase flower yield by increasing plant number per acre up to, say, 6,000 or so plants per 4,800, 5,000 plants per acre. That's what we found. And so the other asterisk to add to that is just because you could produce the most flower yield or marketable portion of from a hemp plant didn't mean that it was the most profitable. So for anyone who has looked into hemp production, they will know that hemp planting material is very expensive. The seeds are expensive because at least then and still some now, we're using feminized seeds. So I mentioned earlier, most of the desirable portion of for essential oil production is female flowers. And so at the time, and still some now, people were using feminized seeds. So ideally 98 or 99% female seed. And so that's the other thing. We also found that once your plant populations got so high that it often wasn't the most profitable based on how much input cost you had. And so there's about 5 or 6 different factors that play into whether hemp is going to be profitable. And it's not just yield. It's the value of the cannabinoids or the oil that producers are looking to market. It's the cost of the inputs, such as basically plant material, and so that all kind of factors into whether a production system is going to be profitable.
Sure. And what information did you find for your pinching research?
Yeah, so the pinching research showed that there was no difference in pinching, that it didn't really move the needle either way from a total flower yield standpoint. That's what if readers look at the paper, that's what we commonly refer to as flower yield, and that's because that's where those essential oils are held in greatest abundance on the trichomes that are found in and on mostly female flowers, or at least that's where the density is the highest. There's trichomes all over the plant, but the trichome density is greatest on the female flowers. And so that's what we found, is that it didn't really change things. So for a practice, whether growers are doing it mechanically or manually, there was really no return on the investment there from a pinching standpoint. So our recommendation moving forward would be just to save that input cost.
Yeah, well, that must be huge for growers to just be able to skip that step. So that's wonderful. So I wanted to kind of loop back to kind of the legal side of things, both for growers and for researchers. So you mentioned that it's can be fairly easy to tip over from kind of that hemp to marijuana side of things. So how is that regulated, both for farmers and then also for researchers like you who may be trying to study the impacts to make sure that, a certain practice doesn't tip the needle over one way or another? So kind of a 2-part question here. How does that work for farmers? Like, are they just regularly tested or samples from their field, or how does that work? And then for researchers, obviously, if you accidentally tip the needle over as part of your research, what happens then? How does that all work?
Right. Yeah. So our regulatory agency was the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services. They were tasked with sampling and monitoring hemp crops within the state. And so because we weren't, all of our end product was destroyed, buried. We buried most of our hemp flower. We were given the latitude to look at this and see how these, because that, it was kind of a critical role we were filling to see how these practices, that was one of the other major things that we looked at, is how did these practices, or if they would change the cannabinoid content. Obviously, if we were doing something that caused the THC content to go above what that plant would normally be at, then that's very valuable information to be able to pass on to farmers. So we were given the latitude to look at these practices, but from a grower standpoint, that they had to, our message to them was to sample early and sample often, because they didn't have any latitude to go above that threshold. So anything, if they had a crop that was essentially indemnified, it was crop destruct. There's very little things that you can do to bring that concentration back down. We did some research previously where we followed cannabinoids through the season from initiation to flowering, well beyond harvest, what would be typical for harvest. And we found that these cannabinoids, THC and CBD, would peak, but the thought process early was, well, I'll just wait and it'll come down. Well, it doesn't come down. So that's from a producer standpoint. If it ever went above that threshold, the odds of it coming down, we saw maybe one instance in 2 years over a bunch of different varieties where it actually came down. So it came down back below the threshold where it would be legal again. So there's effort to change that, because so from a medical marijuana standpoint, you would see THC contents of 15, 18, 20% THC. Industrial hemp, you would really struggle to see anything over 1%. So I know there's efforts within the industry, lobbying efforts to try to get that threshold moved, because I think that the 0.3% is a pretty arbitrary number and it's really hard to meet. One out of, I think, 9 varieties that we've tested over 2 years actually maintained below that threshold. Everything else went above it. So I think it's, there's an effort and a legitimate effort, I think, to get that threshold raised to 1%. Still probably not enough to be psychoactive, but it gives farmers some flexibility to actually produce a crop that can go to full maturity. That's the thing that we found, is that none of these we could let go to full maturity and they would stay below the federal threshold. So now whether that happens, who knows? That's really a political problem. But I certainly think it would be beneficial and give some farmers some flexibility with this crop, because there's very little right now. And what we found is in about 2 weeks, it can go really less than that. We've seen it do it in 10 days. It will go below threshold to above threshold in a matter of 10 days. So it's a very quick process once those flowers start to mature. So it's something that growers have to be cognizant of because of the investment they have in these crops.
Sure. Yeah. I bet if there's anything that's keeping you from going out in the field or something, weather or whatever, that could cause some serious problems as well. So do farmers just have insurance for that? I mean, specifically hemp farmers, or what do they just risk it? I mean, how does that work?
I'm not sure what the current, I think producers now, and like I said, I've kind of fallen out of hemp research in the last year or so. I think they can now get crop insurance, but through USDA, but that's really for crop loss. And losses, I don't think loss is defined in that situation as THC threshold being breached. Essentially, that may be a weather-related crop loss. Not so. No, I think growers who are producing hemp for cannabinoids have to. My recommendation was to sample every 3 days, give or take, for cannabinoids, really primarily THC, to make sure they didn't go above the threshold.
Sure. All right. So we've talked about this a little bit, but there seems to be a wealth of opportunities for future research. So where do you see opportunities, either branching off from your own research that was done on this or just hemp research in general? Where are we going?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the essential oil side, if it's going to be sustainable, it's going to have to be mechanized. I mean, you just can't. We can't afford manual labor in many specialty crops, like well-established specialty crops, and the value of essential oils from hemp has really plummeted in the last 3 to 4 years. So they seem to have reached kind of a stable point now. So I think for the crop on the essential oil side to be sustainable long term from an economic standpoint, it has to be mechanized. There has to be, and I think that's easily done, somewhat easily done. The harvest has to be mechanized. The drying has to be mechanized. The extraction is mechanized already. So I just think that this crop has to go to somewhat of a hands-off approach, literally. So, the model, because when we were doing this, the crop wasn't even direct seeded, it was transplanted. So seedlings were produced in a greenhouse, just like listeners may be familiar with tomatoes or watermelon, something like that. So I think it needs to be direct seeded, mechanically harvested, very little manual labor for it to be a sustainable crop. The other problem, one of the problems with industrial hemp is the regulations that surround it are anything but concrete. To my knowledge, it's still not defined whether it's a nutritional supplement or it's a pharmaceutical. So I think until these things are defined, it keeps a lot of investors on the sidelines. So, I mean, there are defined pharmaceuticals from cannabis plants. Epidiolex is used for a type of childhood epilepsy. But other than that one instance, they sit in this gray area of exactly what they are, and that really determines how they're regulated. So,
sure, makes a lot of sense. Well, this conversation has been so informative. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I have 3 questions left for you. So the first one is, if people want to learn more about any of the things that we talked about today, where can they go for more information?
Sure. So the states that are that really kind of dove into hemp production, their cooperative extension service. Hopefully, most readers are familiar with their state cooperative extension service. They can find resources there for hopefully homegrown information that's been done in their state, production practices. I know, at least for example, in the state of Florida, we have our research and extension faculty that have been working on hemp have a pretty robust website with our information, our research information that's compiled in one place. I know Kentucky is the same way. So that's what I would say for readers to try to look for that. To my knowledge, there's a National Hemp Council that's advocating on behalf of the crop. So those would be the first 2 places I would look to try to find information, because it's going to, we talked about earlier, because this is a day length sensitive crop, you can't take information that's a research that was done in North Dakota and apply it to Texas or vice versa. So that's the one quirky nature of hemp, because it's a day length sensitive crop. You really need information, and in the same way, east to west. I mean, to take information from Colorado or New Mexico and apply it to the humid Southeast is probably not going to be appropriate either.
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was a question I decided to drop about, just pulling information from like other countries that didn't have that, 60, 70 year gap. So then next question is, if people want to then take the next step and get involved with any of this, and that could be from a grower, researcher, consumer perspective, what can they do?
I would say start with your state regulatory agency. to figure out because in many states there's licensure that growers need to have or whatever they are need to have to be able to produce hemp. So check with your regulatory agency to make sure everything you're doing is above board. So it's probably your state Department of Agriculture. I know in many states the State Department of Ag has been tasked with that. So whether it's in every state's different. Most states are going to require a permit or a license, and at least in the state of Florida, you had to let the Department of Ag know where it was going to be, what your planting dates were, so on and so forth. And I'm sure those are different everywhere. So start with your regulatory agency first to make sure that you won't run into any problems, because that's the thing. I mean, it could be a law enforcement issue if it's done improperly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great advice. So then, final question is, what is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Geez. One fun fact. I don't know if there is any fun facts. I'm a long distance cyclist. That's what I like. I like bike packing, and I find it a great way to kind of unplug and disconnect is when the only thing that you're thinking about, and I'm sure hikers think the same thing, is your next source of food and water. It's pretty easy to clear your mind. And so that helps me disconnect from all the day to day is when the only thing I'm thinking about is turning the pedals over and finding my next food and drink. It's pretty good for my mental health.
Wow, that sounds great. I'm not a biker, but that's a good pitch. Or cyclist. I'm neither. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate you taking the time, doing the research, helping these growers. Obviously, it's a very unique crop and with its own unique set of challenges. So kudos to you and all of the researchers and farmers working on it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks. Glad to help.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Lovepreet. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Hello, Abby. Thank you for having me. I'm Lovepreet Singh, graduate student in the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences at Mississippi State University. I'm majorly working on plant breeding genetics and genomics.
Wonderful. And can you tell us about your current research project?
Sure. As I told you, my major area is plant breeding genetics and genomics. I'm majorly working on Bermuda grasses, genus Cynodon. The specific project on which I'm working is genome-wide association study for agronomic traits in Bermuda grass, which will help in developing new and efficient cultivars of Bermuda grass. So we have a big germplasm panel of around 206 accessions from all over the world representing diverse collection. We are looking at the genetic and phenotypic diversity of these accessions, and the major and the big goal is to find the genomic regions which are associated with the morphological traits like leaf length, leaf width, internode distance, and stem diameter, which will help plant breeders in making selections.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
That's a very interesting question, actually. So I want to become a successful plant breeder one day and want to lead my own breeding program. So I have a lot of specific projects I would say to work on. But broadly, I would like to include big data analytic approaches like machine learning, deep learning, and high throughput phenotyping are another innovative approaches to my breeding program by which I can contribute to the field of plant breeding to serve the society better by developing new and resilient cultivars for better production and quality.
Awesome. Well, if anyone would like to get in touch with Lovepreet about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was nice to meet you.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.